Welcome everyone. So I'm Lynzi Armstrong. I'm a lecturer in Criminology at Victoria University in Wellington. And this is my colleague, Professor Gillian Abel from the School of Population Health at the University of Otago. Thank you all for coming to hear us speak. I really appreciate so much that you've given up an hour of your day. So thank you very much. And thank you to Jordan for inviting us to be here. I feel so privileged to get to speak in this amazing space at this exhibition. I think it's so powerful, for starting conversations and thinking about sex work issues. So yeah, thank you to Jordan and thank you to the team here at Deco as well for hosting us. So we're going to be talking about decriminalisation of sex work in New Zealand, and we're going to structure the discussion a bit around our new edited book that was just published last week, which is titled Sex Work and the New Zealand Model, Decriminalisation and Social Change. So although Gillian and I edited the book, I just want to acknowledge that we have contributions in it from a really diverse range of academics, activists and sex workers who contributed chapters too, and it wouldn't be what it is without their contributions. So I just wanted to say that before we get into it. So we're going to keep it fairly broad in this presentation, and we're going to take you through a bit of background to the decriminalisation of sex work here in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, a bit about what the impacts are, what we know from the existing evidence, where New Zealand sits within the international landscape of sex work policy, and then also what the enduring challenges and issues are now in this current context. So we're going to mix it up a bit so you don't get kind of fed up of listening to the same voice and sort of go backwards and forwards. And Gillian's just going to open up now by giving you a bit of an introduction to the Prostitution Reform Act and how it came to be.
Thanks, Lynzi. Sex work has been decriminalised now for 17 years in New Zealand, so it was decriminalised in 2003. I've been doing research since prior to that, from 1997, so I've seen quite a change in sex work in New Zealand over the last 23 years. And it looks vastly different. Sex work looks vastly different now as to what it did in the late 1990s when I first started doing this research. In the book that we've just produced, a chapter was written by New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, and it talked about how NZPC were formed and why they were formed. So NZPC actually is quite a well-established organisation. They formed in 1987, and there were 7 sex workers in Wellington that formed NZPC, and they did this because they were concerned about the amount of exploitation that was happening in the industry and wanted to be able to do something about it. It was also at a time when HIV/AIDS had sort of hit the country. It was the 80s, and the government were looking at how they could minimise the spread of HIV, and they engaged with this new group that had formed, NZPC, and started funding them to provide sexual health information to sex workers and condoms and so on. So that was, they've been funded by the Ministry of Health ever since. But they were really concerned about the exploitation, and if we look in brothels, or they were massage parlours then, because ostensibly what was happening there was a massage, and what was negotiated in the room was something different. But brothel operators were fining sex workers for minor offences, so their take-home money was very little. They had no right to refuse to see a client for whatever reason, and they were often forced to see people they didn't really want to see. The condom issue was a bit of a problem because although the Ministry of Health was funding condoms to be distributed to sex workers, if police raided brothels and found condoms on the premises, they could close the brothel down. And so there was a disincentive for brothel operators to get people to use condoms within the brothels. So that was a real problem, and also there was police entrapment. So police would pose as clients, come into brothels, and it was illegal to solicit, so if a sex worker asked for money for sex, they could be charged. So there was all this sort of exploitation that was happening, and there was no way that people could go to the police if something bad happened to them. Also on the streets, Māori transgender sex workers were particularly targeted for arrest, and the majority of arrests made were from the street, and the majority were Māori people who were arrested. So from very early on, from the late 80s, early 90s, NZPC were pushing for decriminalisation because of what was happening. And they actually wrote the first draft of the Prostitution Reform Bill. So it's policy written by sex workers for sex workers, which makes it more relevant, not somebody outside kind of making up what sex work should look like. So anyway, the NZPC were pivotal in drafting the Prostitution Reform Bill. It was tidied up by a professor of law at Victoria University. And it was submitted to Parliament in 2000 by Tim Barnetta's private members bill, where it stayed for 3 years being debated. And what went in, that Prostitution Reform Bill that went into Parliament in 2000, was very different in 2003 when it was passed, because it went through so many amendments, to appease members of Parliament. And so it was passed in 2003 by a very small majority, 60 votes to 59 with 1 abstention, so it just squeaked through. And we were the first country to decriminalise, and at that stage New South Wales was the only state in Australia that had decriminalised. We were the first country to decriminalise, and we remain the only country in the world to have decriminalised. And Lynzi's going to talk a little bit more about the international context.
Thank you. So to really, I guess, fully understand the significance of the New Zealand model of decriminalisation, it's important to know how it's kind of positioned in relation to the rest of the world and sex work policies in other countries. And also how it's been perceived outside of the New Zealand context too. So as Gillian just told you, New Zealand's the only full country to have decriminalised sex work. It's decriminalised in New South Wales and Australia and in the Northern Territories, but New Zealand's the only full country to have done so. Now there's a handful of places like Germany, the Netherlands, the state of Victoria in Australia, Nevada in the US that have legalised sex work, which is not the same as decriminalisation. But confusingly, people often talk about decriminalisation and legalisation interchangeably. So legalisation involves a lot more state control and a lot of regulation, and regulation that is intended to kind of contain and restrict the sex industry, instead of regulation that's actually intended to make sex workers' lives better, as it is in New Zealand. So while we do have regulation within New Zealand's decriminalised framework, for the most part, it's not onerous to comply with, and there's a lot more control afforded to sex workers. And it's very explicitly focused on sex worker safety and rights. So New Zealand's model is very unique in that respect. Now there's a large and active sex worker rights movement around the world globally, and sex workers involved in this advocacy have been calling for decriminalisation to be adopted more widely, and they've been calling for this for a very long time. But despite this, the most common approach to sex work policy remains variants of either partial or full criminalisation. But there are many countries that have woken up to the fact that this hasn't worked, and they're seeking to reform their sex work laws. So there's been a lot of debate in recent years in many places around the world about trying to change sex work laws. But unfortunately, sex workers have not been listened to in the same way that they were in New Zealand. So these calls for decriminalisation have not resulted in decriminalisation being adopted more widely. And within these debates, New Zealand's model of decriminalisation is often pitted against another legislative approach, which is known as the Nordic model, because it was initially adopted in some Nordic countries. And so that model has been adopted more commonly in recent years than the New Zealand model. And the exact details of it vary between jurisdictions, but the kind of, I guess the focus of it is on criminalising the clients of sex workers, and the rationale for that is that those who endorse it believe that the sex industry is inherently exploitative and abusive, and therefore it's seen as a sensible thing to do to try and reduce the sex industry by targeting people who pay for sex. And there's been a lot of critique of this approach by sex workers in countries where it's been adopted and right around the world, who say that it makes them less safe, it makes them more vulnerable to exploitation and unfair treatment. And there has been research conducted in several countries, so for example, France, Norway, Sweden, Canada, which has shown that it is detrimental and that it has negative impacts on sex workers. But despite this evidence, it continues to be adopted more widely. And there are people who are actively campaigning for it. And these same campaigners are very, very critical of New Zealand's sex work policy approach. So they've argued that in New Zealand, the law has failed to achieve what it set out to do, which was to make sex workers safer and to give them rights. They say that it's been a failure. However, this speculation by these critics of decriminalisation is not backed up by evidence. And research on the impacts of decriminalisation tells quite a different story to what they say. So I'm going to pass you back to Gillian now, who's going to talk about what those impacts are.
Yep. So, as part of one of the amendments that was made to the Prostitution Reform Act while it was in Parliament was that it had to be evaluated. So they wanted to make sure that this law would actually work. So there was an evaluation done within 5 years of it being passed, and some of my research contributed to that evaluation. And one of the key things that the people who were anti-decriminalisation were arguing at that time was that if you decriminalise, there's going to be so many people wanting to come and work in the sex industry. Like everybody and their mother would want to go and work as a sex worker, and it would just get out of control. So we did an estimation at the time sex work was decriminalised, and we did one 5 years later. There had been no increase in numbers, so we were able to debunk that theory which went with decriminalisation. And as Lynzi said, the purpose of the PRA was to protect the health and safety of sex workers and their human rights. And all of the research suggests that this has had, there's been very positive moves in this regard. So if we look firstly at the relationship with the police, that a lot of sex workers now will report stuff to the police when something's happened to them. Although it's kind of patchy, Teela Gilmore contributed a chapter to our book where she looked at the relationship between transgender people on the streets and their relationship with police. And she said there's still some hesitation. She found there's still some hesitation of transgender street-based workers to report things to the police because they sometimes get negative reactions from police. And it's related to the stigmatisation of people who are different in society. So stigma is still an ongoing issue, and Lynzi will talk about that a bit more a bit later. But mostly, street-based sex workers in particular reported that they're more likely to report things to the police nowadays. There was also a chapter in our book where Shannon Moa interviewed clients, and she found that clients are a lot more likely to respect the rights of sex workers now. It's a very positive talk from the clients. Written into the Prostitution Reform Act that there's a right that you cannot force a sex worker to see a client. If a sex worker agrees to see a client and changes their mind, they're quite entitled to do so with no comeback on them at all. So it's reduced the right of brothel operators to insist that they see particular clients as well. And there's some cases that have come to court where people have not respected their right of refusal. They're also entitled to good and safe working conditions. Now, sex workers are not employees, they're independent contractors, so they can't go to the employment courts, but they can use the Human Rights Tribunal, and few have used that. One particular case a few years ago was a sex worker who took a brothel operator to court because of sexual harassment. This was verbal sexual harassment, and she won that case and won $25,000 in that case. And I interviewed her for a research project, and she said that the reason she did this was so that other sex workers could see that you could actually use the courts and there could be a favourable outcome. And most of the court cases, well, all of the court cases that I know of, sex workers have had name suppression. If they wanted name suppression, they get names. So it's not out in the open that they're a sex worker. It's not, their names are not printed in the newspaper. And the more sex workers get confidence in being able to report and still remain anonymous, the more cases will come to court. They also have the right to determine what services they provide. So they decide what services, not the brothel operator. It's not to say that everything is rosy. There are hiccups, and they're caused by some of the amendments that were put into the Prostitution Reform Act while it was in Parliament. And in a short while, I'll discuss one of those amendments, which was to do with migrant sex workers. But before that, Lynzi's going to talk about remaining challenges related to stigma. Thank you.
So as Gillian's just said, decriminalisation has had a range of really, really positive impacts on sex workers in New Zealand. But of course, we know that laws do not kind of solve everything and create these kind of perfect societies. They're not a panacea in that respect. So there are still some challenges and some more work that needs to be done. So the legacy of stigma is definitely one of those remaining challenges, and it's really central to, I think, several chapters of the book. Stigma comes through really strongly, and it's obviously a very, very key theme to this exhibition, this issue of stigma and discrimination too. So the stigma associated with sex work has a very long history. It's linked back really to the patriarchal legacy which cemented social judgments of women's sexuality, and it created these divisions between women, specifically what gets referred to as the Madonna-whore dichotomy, where women are either considered chaste and good or sexual and bad. So the stigma that we see today is, it's not something that's kind of just come around in recent years. It's very, very historically rooted. And the stigma is also connected to the laws surrounding sex work, which arguably really kind of, I guess, reinforce and reflect how sex workers are seen in society. So criminalisation of sex work, for example, has long been associated with high levels of stigma, with actually exacerbating stigma. So I guess that raises the question then of whether decriminalisation may help to shift stigma over time. And the enduring impacts of stigma was something that was raised in the research that Gillian and colleagues conducted to evaluate the Prostitution Reform Act, particularly in relation to it still being quite a significant barrier to sex workers reporting violence, for example. But the Prostitution Law Review Committee report stressed that stigma was going to take time to dissipate. It's not something that is going to change overnight. And we're now obviously 17 years down the track from the law changing. So it's important that we continue to look at it and to try and get a sense of whether things have started to shift. So people who oppose the sex industry often argue that stigma is a good thing. They actually think that it's a positive thing because they think it's a deterrent to people getting involved in sex work. And even people who are not anti-sex work, but who haven't experienced what it is to be stigmatised themselves, may not understand why stigma is actually so important to undo, why it's so significant. But stigma is just so central to so many of the challenges faced by sex workers. So it's associated with violence and with harassment. It can have really serious impacts on family and intimate relationships. It can result in discrimination, which impacts work opportunities like finding somewhere to work from, advertising opportunities, It also makes it more difficult for people to shift into other forms of work outside of the sex industry if that's something that they decide that they want to do, at a later point. It plays out in courtrooms, in airports, in banks, and in a myriad of very mundane, everyday interactions too. It's everywhere, and if we could make inroads into eroding stigma, it would impact on so many other issues and so many other experiences. So it's really important that we continue to look at it. And because of stigma, it's very common for sex workers to really closely guard information about their work. So to be quite selective about who they tell about their work and who they don't. So compartmentalising and keeping secrets is often a really important protective strategy against stigma. And the extent to which people feel that they can actually talk openly about their work is quite an important indicator of stigma too. So how comfortable then are sex workers in New Zealand today, sharing information about their work with other people, telling people about their work? Well, that's a focus of one of the chapters of the book, co-written by me and Sherida Fraser, who works at the Wellington NZPC, and also as a researcher with me at Vic on my current project. So we did some interviews in 2018 with 20 sex workers. We're currently doing some more interviews now for a new project. And for the most part, those that we have interviewed for these projects have not internalised stigma at all. They don't feel ashamed to be a sex worker. And on the contrary, are often very proud of that part of their life, and proud that this is something that they've done. But stigma really limits the ability to actually talk about sex work in that way. So for example, one of the people we interviewed in 2018, Sophie, said, "I'm immensely proud to be a sex worker, and I just want to tell everyone. I want to scream it from the rooftops, but you can't. You just can't talk about it in that way. Oh, I can't talk about it in the way that I want to." So she really wanted to be able to share this about herself, but because of stigma, she wasn't able to. So several participants in this research had told people that they were close to about their work, and had actually received quite positive and supportive responses. So it was quite common for people to describe that. For example, Clementine, a young woman in her early 20s who is a university student, told me about how she had told all of her flatmates that she was going to start working. And the night that her photos were going up on the website for the first time, they all gathered around the computer, and they were really excited, and her photos went up, and they all kind of were really telling her how great she looked and how happy they were for her, and it was a really lovely, heartwarming story, of actually a really supportive response from other young women. But not everyone had such positive experiences, and the most negative and traumatic experiences were recounted by people who were not white, who were not cisgender, and who worked on the street. So not indoor sex work. So for example, Kayla, who told me that she'd been spat at by people she told, she'd been barred from seeing her nieces and nephews because she was seen to be, dangerous to them because of her work. And so it really reinforces the importance, I guess, of when we think about stigma and how it impacts people, recognising that stigma is particularly pronounced for some sex workers because of racism, because of transphobia, because of homophobia, and also perceptions of the type of work that they do and where they do it. So there's factors that influence, how people experience that and how they receive it. But even among those who did have positive experiences, they got kind of positive and supportive responses from people. What consistently came through was just this kind of constant emotional labour that accompanied, when you tell someone and when you get a reaction, what you've got to do to manage that reaction. And the kind of filtering of information that still needed to be done because of stigma. So for example, Bella, who I interviewed in 2018 as well, reflected, you have a day which sucks, and then you can't tell people that, because you know there's already that stigma and they're just waiting to rescue you. So like in retail, you can come home and be like, had a shit day. But if you come home and say, I've had a shit day, I had this client who was a dick, people are horrified and they see that as trauma. And so it can be exhausting if you're not in the mood to be this bubbly, positive, superb sex worker, super great. So participants' experiences really clearly illustrated this, continuous emotional burden that came with either not being able to tell or also just not being able to talk freely, about the highs and the lows, the mundane experiences, and the kind of, the less positive experiences, because, stigma really restricted what they could say because of these reactions that they would get. And it was clear that being able to talk openly was incredibly freeing, and really, really, really positive for people. So for example, Jordan explained, not having to lie is a lot more freeing, and being able to not censor what you're talking about. Like when someone says, how was your day? I have to automatically think, right, do I tell you some made up mundane story about how my day was because you don't know I'm a sex worker? Or can I say, yeah, I shoved my finger up a guy's arse today, it was fantastic, what did you do? And so you're constantly filtering that out. What's my lie? What's my preparation? What's my story? And it's really tiring having to think beforehand, crap, where in the lie am I? What kind of story have I told? And you don't want it to be a lie. So I think that gets through just really positively, really strongly, that kind of pressure of having to kind of contain, and when you don't have to contain, how freeing it is. Encouragingly though, 2 of the participants in this project who had worked pre-decriminalisation felt that there had been some positive shifts, and that they could now be more open in the decriminalised context. So that was something that was very encouraging. Most of the participants hadn't worked pre-decriminalisation, because now so much time has passed, there are not that many people who are still working, who worked pre-decriminalisation. So it was interesting that there was a little bit of a divide there, that those who had worked pre-decriminalisation felt that things had changed and that they could be a bit more open with people. But overall, it was really clear that stigma is still a significant emotional burden, and so it is an issue that we need to continue working on, to make more inroads. And I think again, like exhibitions like this one are just so powerful and important in just shifting things along a bit and starting conversations. So again, just congratulate Jordan and all of the artists who contributed to this, because I think that this is so powerful. So I'm going to pass on to Gillian now, who's going to talk about one of the other kind of enduring issues, which, as she mentioned, is the situation with migrant sex workers.
Thanks, Lynzi. So yes, very late in the piece when the Prostitution Reform Bill was going through Parliament, in fact just before it was voted on, Section 19 was added to the bill, which stated that basically you could only work as a sex worker in New Zealand if you were a citizen or resident. So if you come into the country on a temporary visa, on a work visa, or as on a student visa, you are not able to work in the sex industry. It's the only occupation singled out that a migrant person cannot do. So in decriminalising sex work ostensibly in the eyes of the law is work as any other. So why is it singled out? So there was a lot of talk in Parliament, again from people who voted against decriminalisation, that should we decriminalise, we were going to become a haven for traffickers, that there were going to be sex workers trafficked into New Zealand. And I don't know the logic of how this was likely to happen. We've never had people trafficked into New Zealand before, and we still do not have any evidence that there's been people forced to come into New Zealand and sell sex. And it's open, what this section has done is open the door for exploitation. So if somebody is found to be working in sex work and they're on a temporary visa, they can be deported from the country. So that brings with it it's virtually it's criminalised, which goes back to what the whole of sex work was like before 2003, where exploitation can flourish. And immigration, the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment, where immigration sit within, they actually contracted Michael Roguski and myself to look at the experiences of migrant sex workers in New Zealand. And in typical government department style, they only gave us 3 months to do it, which is a very short time if you're working in research to do really robust research. And when you're trying to find and talk to people, migrant sex workers who don't want to be found and don't want to talk for fear that they're going to be deported, it's really difficult. So we did talk to a number of migrant sex workers, but most of them were those that were not at greatest risk. So those who are not at great risk are English-speaking white migrants. So people coming from the United States or Germany who can speak English, and they go and get jobs in mainstream brothels, and they have very few problems. There is that niggle in the back of their mind that if they found out they could be deported. But generally they have quite a good experience working in New Zealand. If clients do ask them about their accent and whether they come from another country, they say, oh yes, I'm from Germany, but I've been here for a number of years, so they can kind of cover it up that they're not a migrant. The people that really are having a difficult time are the non-English speaking people that come to the country, and in particular Asian sex workers that come here, who can't speak English, don't go into those normal mainstream brothels and land up in suburban brothels, which are fairly underground and where they experience quite a lot of exploitation. So they do come to light through NZPC, and NZPC have a dedicated person who speaks Mandarin and is on WeChat, which is the sort of Chinese equivalent of Facebook, and can get in contact with some of these migrant workers and gets to hear about some of the things that are going on. Some migrant workers will come into NZPC and go to the sexual health care, where also the nurses and the doctors can talk to them. But here in Auckland it's different from other DHBs, district health boards, in that when they come to NZPC they have to show their passport, and that deters a lot of people from actually going through and getting sexual health checkups. What NZPC have also found is that some migrant workers are reporting money being withheld by brothel operators. So, and one was just, NZPC here in Auckland found that one sex worker had $18,000 withheld by the operator, and they wondered if she had actually earned any money, been given any money at all. Clients also can get away with not paying because they feel quite reassured that sex worker will not go to the police about it and risk deportation. Some migrant workers, sex workers, are being raped by brothel operators and by people posing as clients. So some migrant workers will work privately and go around the country, stay at motels, and some have been raped while they've been in those motels and have been too afraid to report it to the police. There are also demands for unprotected sex. So what Section 19 has opened up is a prime area for blackmail. So these migrant sex workers are being blackmailed, they're being exploited, and have got no recourse to the legal system at all. So we've written about this in the book, and Lynzi's also, she's done some research looking at what New Zealand sex workers say about migrant sex workers, and then Michael and myself talked about this small study we did for MB, and the argument that we're trying to make is that if the PRA is really about making sex workers work as any other, and creating fair and working conditions, how does Section 19 stack up against this? So there's no evidence that anybody has been trafficked into New Zealand to sell sex. The only trafficking offence that has come into the courts, and it's just been on the news this week, has been to do with the horticultural industry. But yet you can come into New Zealand still and work in horticulture. So if in the eyes of the law sex workers work as any other, why is it the only occupation singled out? It's not available for migrants, and that's a question that I think we need to deal with in New Zealand, because people are really being badly exploited while we sit here with this section in place.
Thank you. So we spent quite a bit of time today talking, looking back and thinking about the present context, but to make change we really need to look towards the future. And what else can we do? And as Gillian just said, looking at amending Section 19 would be a very, very positive step in the right direction. I just wanted to leave you with some questions to kind of mull over before we open up for you to ask us questions. You don't have to answer these questions, but just put them out there. So if you're not a sex worker, what can you do in the context of your life to better support sex workers in society? How often do you speak up if someone makes a joke or an offensive comment about sex workers? If you run a business, how inclusive is your business of sex workers? What could change to improve that? If a friend, a family member, an employee, a student, a tenant told you that they were a sex worker or they had been, how would you respond in a way that lets them know that you truly support them and doesn't make them feel stigmatized? So just some things to kind of think about. Thank you all so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate that you've come and you've listened to us speak. It's really, really good of you. And we can now open up if anyone has any questions that they want to ask us. Thank you.
The issue of stigma is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because it just cuts into our whole sort of social hypocrisy. That here we are, stigmatizing people who have a place and right to work in this country, and who have been around for a very long time, and now through the legislation it's being sort of surfaced and given credibility. But the stigma is such a fascinating thing to me that that it's at the it's a real cold face, isn't it, of our sort of hypocrisy in society.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think really agree with what you said there, and I think it's it's so deeply connected to these kind of historical ideas about sexuality and gender, and I think that we live in a society where people are still so uncomfortable just talking about sex as well, and I think that has a lot to do with it too. Because it's still seen as a kind of a taboo subject, and it is extremely hypocritical.
Yeah, and do you think that has a sort of religious, like Christian religious background to it?
Absolutely. So I think, if we look at kind of Christianity, I think it does historically relate to religion. Absolutely. If we think about kind of, I guess, like ideas around sexual purity and whatnot, and women and sexuality and the kind of Adam and Eve story, all that sort of thing, definitely.
Do you think the same stigma that's directed at women is directed at men as sex workers?
I think it's different. I think that they definitely are also stigmatised, but it's a different type of stigma. So I think a lot of the stigma that gets directed towards male sex workers has a lot of links to homophobia. I mean, of course, there are male sex workers who see female clients. It's not, not all male sex workers are seeing male clients, but I think that there's an interesting divide where male sex workers who see female clients, it's kind of almost like seen so differently. Like if you think of movies like Magic Mike and whatnot, like it's seen as being completely and sort of cool compared to that's my impression anyway. I think that there's a divide there. So the stigma is there, but I think it's quite different.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
What led you both to produce this book? Like your personal journeys? Do you have,
So the book really came out, I guess, from we had a symposium in early 2018, which was focused on stigma and discrimination and sex workers' rights. And a group of us came together and presented on different topics that were of interest to us. And we kind of realised that since the book that Gillian produced with her colleagues after the law passed, there hadn't really been anything else in terms of a book. So we thought that it would be quite powerful to, I guess, do something that is more in the kind of current context. Yeah.
And because we're the only country that have decriminalised, there's a lot of interest around the world in what's happening here, because even though they haven't got decriminalisation, there's a lot of people on the ground in every country pushing for it in their own country, and so they're needing the evidence to kind of support their arguments as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the evidence is really important, especially when there's so much misinformation and just constant kind of speculation about New Zealand's approach that isn't supported by evidence. So yeah, that was definitely a strong motivator as well.
What are the books called, please?
The first one, which we published in 2010, which was around the early impacts of decrim, was called Taking the Crime Out of Sex Work. And so this is sort of a later edition now that we're sort of 17 years down the track. And because I think that a lot of the research that book drew on was sort of in the first 5 years from decrim when things were settling in. So what's changed in the longer term is what's
Do you think it's the speculation and the misinformation that is the reason why other countries around the world are still adopting the Nordic model rather than decrim? Like, why is it that the Nordic model is so successful?
I think the neo-abolitionists who push the Nordic model, they've got a very loud voice, and they create fear in the minds of people. So they use media and they use other to push the trafficking argument, and that sex workers are victims, and they wouldn't be working by choice, and it's those kind of argument that puts fear into people's minds that they need to save sex workers from working in the industry. Whereas, the opposite is, I don't think I've interviewed somebody who has said they've been forced to work. Some people have more choice than others, obviously, in terms of whether they work or not.
Yeah, I think the neo-abolitionists definitely play a big role in that, because they really weaponise the stigma that relates to sex work. So they use it to make arguments, about policies that should be adopted. And I guess for people who don't know a lot about the sex industry, who've taken all of their ideas from kind of movies and media and TV and whatnot, and who might feel a bit uncomfortable with it, it's actually quite comfortable to listen to some of those arguments. Like, it's actually easier to listen to this kind of message that it is incredibly dangerous, incredibly exploitative, that everyone's being forced. If you're someone who is a bit uncomfortable and who has kind of, I guess, not engaged much in thinking about sex and whatnot differently, if you hear those arguments, it's easier for you to believe that than it is for you to do the work of undoing some of the things that you've been socialised to learn that might not actually be the case for everyone in the world. So yeah, I think that people who are very anti-sex work can sometimes be quite strategic about how they use information to keep people in these boxes of how they think about the sex industry and how they think about sex workers. And that, creates a barrier to changing and to doing things differently. Any more questions?
No, but just to make the comment that we had the opening here on Saturday, and I think there must have been about 80 people here, and it was really the most wonderful event. There were a Kapahaku group, a harpist, a comedian, performer, and to be a part of that community of people, I mean, you just scratch the surface of stigma and there's nothing to fear, there's a lot to celebrate. And it's just like a very sort of thin veneer that exists between, the stigma and the stereotypes and the reality of the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, and having you both here today as well, is really, it continues to break those barriers down, make a big difference, I think. And I think this exhibition really, Tracy said on the night, we celebrate this, we celebrate this community. It's so important to us to be able to celebrate it. So, we are very, pleased to be a part of, change, what we hope is going to be changed.
That's so great to hear, and I think, again, I think this is amazing. I think it's so powerful and so positive, and I hope that there will be lots and lots of people who will get around it. It sounds like it's been really popular so far from...
Yeah, there's been some wonderful engagement every day. It's quite interesting seeing people come in and see the sign and kind of walk directly out, or they've come specifically for this. But like Linda was saying on Saturday night, I talked to a lot of the sex workers, and one of them mentioned to me, they say there's a social community online. They see each other, but she mentioned just to actually celebrate it in one place, because she loves her job. That was really refreshing to me, and that actually broke down a kind of thing that I realised was, I'm so curious about it, but I'm too afraid to ask. So it broke down that stigma that I had, I just want to know what you do. What do you do every day? Tell me about your role. And it broke that down, so it was just really refreshing.
Because a lot of that stigma is visceral, isn't it? Like, it stops you, so you don't actually realise, no matter how little you might think you are, you don't actually realise the extent to which you have been sort of inculcated with some of the prejudices.
Absolutely, there's so many layers out there, but
like privacy. If I'm asking you a question, is it invading your experience, or just so to speak up was quite, to actually ask, what do you do? That kind of broke down that barrier, was good.
That's fantastic. And I think that's the thing. I think people who come here, they'll then go out and they'll have conversations with other people who might come in and look, and it can just, I guess, have a sort of really broad impact and making people think differently. I wish I'd been there on Saturday. It sounded amazing.
It was a fabulous night.
Serious role.
Gillian has done an incredible effort, not only working remotely, involving, curating and coordinating this whole exhibition, but it was fantastic.
It was brilliant. Congratulations.
Thank you so much to both of you for coming. That was very educational.